At Guadalcanal, USS Washington is the last American battleship still in the fight. Every other ship in Ironbottom Sound is sunk, burning, or gone. 4 destroyers are gone. The only other battleship is already out of the fight. 14 Japanese warships are still in the water. If Washington falls, Henderson Field falls. If Henderson Field falls, Japan owns the skies. And if Japan owns the skies, America might not win the war at all. But the Japanese don't know. Washington is still there. It was November 13th, 1942, and the United States Navy's surface fleet in the South Pacific was in ruins. The night before, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan took 12 cruisers and destroyers into Ironbottom Sound and walked them right into a Japanese bombardment force twice their size. In the midst of the chaos, ships fired on their own side in the dark. 2 admirals went down with their bridges, and by dawn, 7 ships were sunk or sinking. But the Japanese were coming back to finish what Callahan had failed to stop, shell Henderson Field and clear the way for the troop convoys. Admiral William Halsey, commander of Allied naval forces in the South Pacific, had one move left, and it was less than ideal. The only choice he had was using USS Washington and USS South Dakota, 35,000-ton displacement battleships that needed room to turn, to maneuver away from torpedoes, and to bring their guns to bear. Ironbottom Sound offered none of that. As Halsey put it, quote, "The narrow, treacherous waters north of Guadalcanal are utterly unsuited to the maneuvering of capital ships, especially in darkness." Still, Task Force 64 was assembled that same afternoon, with 4 destroyers out front, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn, none of which had ever worked together before that afternoon. Behind them, 5,000 yards back, would come the battleships, which had only spent 34 hours in each other's company on a high-speed transit. Now, it was up to this collection of strangers to head into the most dangerous stretch of water in the Pacific. On Washington's bridge, Rear Admiral Willis Lee, the task force commander, and USS Washington's captain, Glenn Davis, had been preparing for a night exactly like this. The former was not an obvious war hero. He chain-smoked Philip Morris cigarettes on the bridge, kept a stack of pulp novels within reach, and had even given himself the radio handle Ching Chong China Lee. What Lee cared about was gunnery. After dinner, when officers not on watch were asked to stay in the wardroom, Lee, Davis, and gunnery officer Lieutenant Commander Edwin Hooper would spread the charts and work through firing solutions, reload times, and every possible scenario for Washington's 9 16-inch guns and her 5-inch battery. Most importantly, while surface search radar technology was still so new that most commanders treated it as a fallback only when visibility was poor, Lee treated it as the primary weapon. Time and time again, he ran drills with the men in all possible conditions, from full dark, high seas, smoke, and rain squalls, until his fire control teams could trust the screen and put a shell exactly where the radar told them to. In the middle of the night, a call came up from the radar room. Contact, bearing east of Savo Island. Lee took a long drag on his Philip Morris and looked out at the black water, then turned to Davis and said, quote, "Well, stand by, Glenn. Here they come." What Lee didn't know was that the force bearing down on them had problems of its own. The night before, Imperial Navy Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe had brought sister battleships Kirishima and Hiei into Ironbottom Sound for the same mission. The latter took over 80 shell hits and was scuttled, becoming the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. As a result, now Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake was on his way back with 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and a destroyer screen. At the back of the formation came Kirishima, her 14-inch guns having already torn through American warships in these exact waters 24 hours earlier. She was old, built in 1914, and her magazines were loaded with Type 3 fragmentation shells designed for airfields, not for cracking open enemy warships. But Kondo was attacking with well-trained crews, lookouts specifically and obsessively trained for night vision, and most importantly, 90 long-lance torpedoes, the finest in the world. Task Force 64 entered Ironbottom Sound in column and ran straight into the Japanese outer screen. and at 11:16 p.m., USS Walk opened fire, and the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal began. Not even 2 minutes later, a long-length torpedo found her, 30 feet of pure oxygen-powered steel, running silent at 48 knots, and broke her right in half. Onboard seaman Nauman Berman recalled seeing Walk get hit, stating, quote, "I didn't realize what it was. Just boom. Goodbye." Mere seconds later, shells and a torpedo hit Preston simultaneously, her aft magazines catching the blast and detonating, causing such a massive explosion that it was visible for miles. Then Benham took a torpedo to the bow and stopped dead in the water. Gwynn took shell hits and fell out of the fight. In roughly 10 minutes, the entire American screen was gone. Below deck, Washington's SG radar was tracking everything. Japanese contacts moving and firing, American ships going silent one by one. Then her 5-inch guns found Ayanami in the pitch black, a target no lookout could have spotted, and tore her apart. 1 back for 4 lost. The burning Walk and Preston were the only light for miles in the dark of Guadalcanal. Washington held to the left, sliding past the wreckage with the flames on her right. Though the crew could hear men in the water screaming as she passed, Captain Davis kept her hidden, well aware of what would happen if he dared to stop. As she vanished, South Dakota came through on the right, the firelight catching her hull, her superstructure, all 35,000 tons of her, exposed and moving against the water. South Dakota had just made herself very easy to find. At 11:30 p.m., every light in South Dakota went out. The battleship's chief engineer had tied down the circuit breaker before the battle, putting the entire electrical system in series, so when one overload hit, radar, fire control, and communications went with it simultaneously. Once power came back, her skipper, Captain Thomas Gatch, ordered his guns to fire. South Dakota's main battery opened up, and the muzzle blast from one of her turrets ignited her own Kingfisher scout planes still sitting on their catapults, burning across her superstructure, her muzzle flashes strobing across the water. Then, when the recoil knocked out fire control a second time, now completely without radar or fire control, South Dakota kept closing on Kondo's bombardment group without knowing it. At last, a searchlight from Otago swung across the black water and found her. Then every Japanese ship that could bear opened up at once. Hiroshima's 14-inch guns, Otago and Takau's 8-inch batteries, destroyers piling on from the flanks. Nearly 30 hits in minutes, fires burning across 3 decks, 38 men gone, and 60 more down. South Dakota's armor held where it had to, as Hiroshima's Type 3 shells were built for airfield facilities, not for cracking open a battleship. They tore up everything above the waterline and killed everyone they touched, but they couldn't sink her. Still floating and still on fire, she turned south and ran. Now, Washington was the only intact ship left in the force. In fact, at that very moment, Washington was the entire United States Pacific Fleet, the sole barrier between Kondo's ships and Guadalcanal. If this one ship could not stop the incoming Japanese ships right then and there, America might just lose the war. But with every gun in the Imperial force pointed at the burning shape of South Dakota limping away, not one of them was looking left. For over 20 minutes, the SG radar had been painting a large contact on the starboard beam, the kind of return that meant tonnage, guns, that meant a battleship. At only 8,400 yards, Washington's 16-inch guns were nearly at point-blank range. Lee's crews were at their stations, loaded and ready to fire at a moment's notice. Yet before the battle, Washington's gunnery officer had flagged a problem with the radar's antenna, a gap in coverage nobody had fixed. And with South Dakota blacked out, radios destroyed, last seen somewhere on the starboard side before going silent, there was a likely possibility she was already in that area. So Lee had no choice but to wait. For a while, on top of Washington's bridge, there was just the sweep of the screen and the large green return on the starboard beam. Lee watching it, with a cigarette burning down between his fingers, Davis beside him. The contact was moving with Kondo's force, tracking with purpose. Then a Otago searchlight came on, sweeping south, and lit up the still-burning South Dakota. With this, Lee took a long last drag of his Philip Morris. Then he turned to Davis and gave the order. At exactly midnight, Washington opened fire on battleship Kirishima, marking the first head-to-head confrontation of battleships during the entire Pacific War. The first salvo missed, with the shells only straddling Kirishima, splashes rising on both sides, close enough that a shocked crew felt the concussion. By then, the gun crews below deck were already reloading. The second salvo found Kirishima's superstructure, right on the third-level bridge, and obliterated everything on it. With the third salvo already on the way, simultaneously, Washington split her 5-inch battery. 2 of the guns swung onto Otago, Congo's flagship, and opened up, while 2 more loaded star shells and fired them into the sky above the Japanese formation, the bursts lighting up Kirishima's hull from above, blinding Japanese gunners trying to find the source of the fire coming out of the dark. The rest of the 5-inch guns were piled onto Kirishima alongside the main battery. With South Dakota still burning to the south and drawing all attention, Washington was freely firing from the left side of the Sound, exactly the place nobody had thought to look. When a report came up that Kirishima was already sunk, Lee paused fire. For 90 seconds, in the middle of the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War, Washington stopped firing. The sound that had been shaking the hull, rattling every compartment, rolling across the water for miles, just stopped. But Kirishima was still out there, still on fire, still turning. Then the correction came through, and Washington opened up again, every gun that could bear pouring onto the same target, 16-inch and 5-inch together, the sound rolling back across Ironbottom Sound like the whole thing had never paused at all. By the time Washington checked fire for good, her crews had put 75 rounds of 16-inch and 107 rounds of 5-inch into Kirishima in roughly 7 minutes. The shells that did the most damage never looked like hits. They struck short, skipping off the flat water, punching into Kirishima below the waterline. Even Lee watched those splashes from the bridge and counted them as misses. Through it all, Washington had not been hit once. By then, Kondo was running out of options. He had a flagship that was damaged, a heavy cruiser that was untouched but alone, and somewhere in the dark, a ship he still couldn't find that had just obliterated Kirishima in 7 minutes. He ordered his force onto a westerly course and fired a last spread of torpedoes into the night toward where he thought Washington might be. They all missed. Lee watched them and knew there was nothing to gain in chasing a withdrawing force through these waters with no destroyer screen, and ordered a zigzag course, taking Washington out of the fight. Kirishima was still out there, turning slowly in a wide circle to port, her rudder gone, her crew fighting the flooding from below. The hits below the waterline, the ones Lee counted as misses, had opened her boilers, which were failing one by one as the water rose. The fires that had started in her superstructure were spreading. Her crew worked through the night, trying to save a ship that was already lost. Nearby, survivors from Walk and Preston had been in the water for hours, desperately clinging to wreckage in the dark while the battle raged around them. They were still there when Kirishima's fires finally went out at 3:25 a.m. on November 15, 1942. The last Japanese battleship ever sunk by another battleship's guns. The Japanese would not seriously threaten Guadalcanal again.